10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 188. Hey everybody, welcome back into episode 188 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. If you're brand new to the show, my name is Nick Manella. I am going to be guiding you through this short and concise jazz lesson, just like we do every single week here on the podcast. And if you are a returning listener, a veteran listener, thank you so much for tuning in once again. Just a reminder, you can get the PDF to this episode and every other episode that we've ever done by going over to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, clicking on one of the Patreon banners, and going over and pledging your support. Only $3 a month gets you every single PDF that we ever do on this show. And Patreon is a fantastic site that allows people like you, the listeners of the show, to support their favorite creators directly and make sure that this content keeps coming at you in high quality on a regular basis, week after week. So if you're interested in supporting the show, interested in getting all those fantastic jazz learning materials, again, 10minutejazzlesson.com. Click on one of the Patreon banners and you'll get instant access to all of that. We have a couple of thank yous for people who have joined up this week. Thank you to Michael, Jim, and Dag. Thank you guys for signing up to becoming members of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson family. To all you patrons out there, that's the only reason we can make this show happen, so we really appreciate it. All right, let's get into today's episode. So this week's episode is a continuation from last week, where we're still going to be talking about using tensions in context, and we're actually still going to be talking about the sharp 11 this week, but we're going to use it over a different chord. We're going to use it over a dominant 7th chord. So we're going to talk about some of the differences and some of the different structures that we can use. We're still going to go over 4 structures this week, but these will all be over a C7 chord. So let's jump right into the first one. So the first structure that I would like to talk about is a B-flat augmented triad over a C7 chord. So if you look at the notes that are contained in that, it would be the flat 7, the 9, and the sharp 11. So again, we're trying to frame that sharp 11 in different contexts to give us something to work from, where we're just not kind of aimlessly playing that sharp 11 just because we know that sharp 11 is supposedly a cool note. Well, it's a cool note when we use it in the right way. So this time we're going to be using it in a B-flat augmented triad. So you could do this over any chord by simply going down to the flat 7 and forming an augmented triad off of that. So let's check out what this triad sounds like. Again, I'm just going to be using those 3 notes over a C7 chord, and let's investigate how this chord actually sounds over the C7. All right, let's do it. All right, so that's a really interesting sound. I always love the sound of augmented triads. I think that they're just a really interesting sound due to the 2 major thirds that are contained in there. We've talked about whole tone and augmented triads before on the show, but it's just still a sound that I really, really like after all these years. All right, so now sort of piggybacking off of this structure, we can come up with another structure that actually contains these same 3 notes, but we're going to add a note to it. So if we add a G onto the bottom of that triad, and we consider the G the root, we get a G minor major 7 chord. So it's a G minor triad with a major 7th on top of it. So G, B flat, D, and F sharp. And what this equates to is 5, flat 7, 9, and sharp 11. Again, continuing to use that sharp 11 to our advantage, but investigating a bunch of different ways that we can fit it into different structures. So you can use this over any dominant 7th chord. All you do is come up with a minor major 7 arpeggio based off of the 5th, and you'll be framing that sharp 11 in a really nice way. Check out how different this sounds with the presence of the G in there as opposed to the last structure I played. All right, let's check this one out. So again, another really interesting sound. And when you add that 4th note in, it gives you a lot more possibilities. So I really dig that sound. Minor, major, 7th chord built off of the 5th of a dominant 7th chord. That's what that is. All right, let's go to a completely different one. So now what we're going to do is we're going to base a minor 7 flat 5 chord off of the sharp 11. So the sharp 11 is going to become the root of that minor 7 flat 5 chord, or half diminished chord, however you want to think about it. So the notes are going to be F sharp, A, C, and E on a C7 chord, and that's going to be sharp 11, 13, the root, and then the 3rd. Those are going to be the notes that it ends up being over the C7 chord. Really dig this sound because it gives us the sharp 11 and the 13, which are 2 fantastic notes. And then framing that very, very nicely, so playing against those tensions, are the root and the 3rd, which we know are like the most solid notes in the chord. So this one has a really interesting mix of tension and then really stable notes mixed in with that tension. And I think that's what makes this sound so appealing, at least to my ears. So let's check out what the F sharp minor 7 flat 5 over C7, a minor 7 flat 5 chord built off of the sharp 11. Let's check out this sound. So you can hear that's also a fantastic option. Notice that you can also just extract an F sharp diminished triad out of that and use that as well. If you want it to be a little bit more simple about it, you would just leave off the 7th of the minor 7 flat 5 chord and you get yourself a triad. That's kind of up to you. You can do both. I only included one just for the sake of the 10-minute jazz lesson podcast and not the 30-minute jazz lesson podcast. All right, so our final one requires a little bit of explanation because we have to talk about our classic tritone substitution. We can't, leave off a discussion on structures over a dominant 7th chord using the sharp 11 without talking about the tritone sub. But the problem here is that it's a little bit more unstable than the other structures that we've been talking about, meaning that we're forming a triad, a major triad, off of the sharp 11. So we have the sharp 11, the flat 7, and the flat 9 if we form that F sharp major triad over a C7 chord. Now, because of the presence of that flat 9, it really wants to resolve. That flat 9 really wants to pull down to a C. So we don't necessarily want to like hang out on this tritone substitution without doing one of two things. The first thing is obvious. We want to resolve the dominant chord to the 1 chord. So, 5 chord to a 1 chord. And I think that's the best place to use the tritone substitution, right? Because it really builds up tension a lot, more so than the other structures that we've been talking about. So because we're building up all that tension, we need to resolve that tension at some point. So that's going to be your best place to use it. But if you want to use a tritone triad over an extended 7th chord, my suggestion to you would be to pair it with the root triad. So to pair that, F sharp major triad with a C major triad. And that's a great way to kind of weave in and out of the tension. All right, so that is my caveat for the last one. Yes, this is a structure that exists that uses the sharp 11, but I want you to think about how and when you're going to use it, because you could get into a situation where it just doesn't really work. And that's the last thing I want to do as a teacher, is show you something and then have you go off and practice it and say, that doesn't really work. So I'm just going to demonstrate really quick pairing the F sharp major triad with a C major triad. So pairing a major triad built off of the sharp 11 with a root triad, a root major triad just built off of the 1. Let's just check out what that sounds like real quick. So you can hear some really cool sounds come out of that, right? But the reason why it sounds cool is because I'm pairing it with that C major triad. So just make sure that you are aware of that. And if you're just hanging out on a tritone sub, you might wonder why it doesn't sound good. That's why it doesn't sound good. We have to frame it in that way. Okay, so we went overtime today, but that's all right. We had a lot of information to get through. Hopefully this was helpful for all of you, and you can start practicing some of those structures over the top of just a static play along. Start to get used to them a little bit. Start to think about them as actually, other chords superimposed over the top of C7. All right, we're going to continue this, a couple more episodes on this, and hopefully we'll wrap up the topic soon. All right, everybody, if you have any questions, make sure you leave me any comments, questions in the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson community Facebook group. That is where we have the discussions on these things. And remember, if you want to show your support to the podcast, Patreon is a great place to do that. You can support us directly in terms of a monthly donation, a very small monthly donation. Make sure we keep coming at you. You can do that, 10minutejazzlesson.com, and click on one of the Patreon banners. All right, have a great weekend, everybody. We will talk to you soon. Bye.